Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar by Core LGBT. Core Recruitment has been doing a series of webinars through the COVID-19 crisis, and specifically with Pride Month as well. We've done interviews with Mark Foster, Keegan Hurst, and Amazon Lafee as well. And today we are very, very lucky to be joined by Lady Phyll. If you don't know Lady Phyll, she's the Executive Director of the Kaleidoscope Trust, founder and Executive Director of Black Pride, lesbian, mother, author, and former civil servant. Welcome, Lady Phyll.
Thank you very, very much. And what a wonderful introduction.
You're very welcome. Now, we'll get straight into it. And I am king of getting acronyms, pronouns, everything in my life pretty much wrong. And I'm going to take this opportunity for a bit of clarity on LGBTI, LGBTQ, which acronyms are we using at the moment, Lady Phyll? If you can talk us through it, that would be great.
So I think you shouldn't be worrying too much because you're not the only one. We all get it wrong. I think it's different places and different spaces. So for Kaleidoscope Trust, we use LGBT plus because, you know, it will feel like there's too many acronyms to put in. And when we're writing briefings for ministers, it will get lost in that. But when we're working with our human rights defenders and partners internationally, we use LGBTI, and that's more because of the laws that are there around LGBTI, and I stands for intersex. For UK Black Pride, we use LGBTQ, which the Q is for queer. However, more recently, we've started using LGBTQ plus because we recognize that we don't have this monolithic, you know, homogenous community, which is just sex. There's the asexual, pansexual. So by adding the plus, we're talking about encompassing all. And just for the record, LGBT is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender.
Now, the next hot bone of contention is pronouns. And I think this is something which is going to come up kind of increasingly over the next couple of years. If you do meet somebody and you're introducing yourself and they're introducing them, I mean, we all love a bit of social awkwardness. You know, how should you address it? Should you address it? Should you say anything? Should you not say anything? Because you get a split second to kind of decide for your introduction to be authentic. How do you handle those situations?
Well, again, I think this is quite situational, but it's important to recognize gender diversity in its fullest. So, you know, I would introduce myself, Phyll. I might say pronouns she, her, depending on if I'm in a conference setting or style. But if there is that awkwardness, I would ask, what's your name? And I may ask what your pronouns are. Or I would just refer to that person as they, them, until the awkwardness has passed of not knowing. But, you know, if you don't ask, you never know. And in this day and age, whilst our young people are very, very expressionful about who they are and how they see themselves, asking is better than, you know, making a mistake.
Understood. But everybody feels the awkwardness. It's not just me. Like, it's everybody gets that, even you, yes?
Well, yeah. I think because it's part of my day job to make sure I know people's names, know people's pronouns, not so much their sexuality, but how I'm referring to them because of settings, that I may have slightly passed that feeling of, do I ask or do I not?
No, it's good to know. If you can tell us a little bit about Black Pride, why you formed it and the challenges you encountered when you set it up.
Well, you know, Black Pride, the genesis and origins of it is in 2004, I was running a women's organisation for Black lesbians, and we decided to take some of that activity offline, and I took them to Southend. Many of them are women who are asylum seekers, refugees, had never even been outside of London. And at that particular point, I was like, this feels so wonderful. We felt liberated, empowered to be in a space which was absolutely phenomenal. And then in 2005, I went to, I would say, leaders within the LGBT plus community to say to them, I think that you know, it's great that we have prides and other things that are happening, but we need to look at the issues of how we challenge not just homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, but how we deal with the issues of systemic racism, which is structural as well, even within our own LGBT plus community. And I want to set up a Black Pride. Well, it wasn't well received. I think that there's this natural fear of, you know, anything which organizes itself in the name of Black or Blackness, as we see with the Black Lives Matter movement and how people react or don't react to it. But I think, you know, I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams, I believe. So hearing a no has got to certainly be a yes for us. And, you know, we couldn't just stand still and not do anything about it, because in 2005, there was such a surge of the BNP and also the NF, and some of the rhetoric that was being put out there around Islamophobia, sexism, racism. It was quite misogynistic. As Black people, Black and brown people, as well as being queer and LGBT people, we couldn't divorce ourselves from what we were hearing, what we were seeing, and what we were feeling. So, you know, the right thing to do is to make sure that we're supporting communities to challenge, because of the many different facets that make up who we are as people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Black Pride is very much something which is for everybody in terms of African, Asian, Caribbean, Middle East, African descent. I mean, do you think that you'll stick with the name Black Pride long term, or do you think you'll move that?
I think Black Pride has such a significant brand and name to it. And the genesis, as I mentioned, of why it started and how it started, to change the name, I think that you would lose the essence of that. Would you call it a POC pride, an urban pride, you know, a BAME pride or a BME pride? It doesn't quite have the same resonance, but we do on our board and our core team have people from Iran, I think, yeah, Pakistan, South Asians on our board. So they bring their networks, and people believe in what UK Black Pride sets out to do. So it may be a conversation. You know, I never say no to anything, but I don't think Stonewall will think about changing its name, even though the origins of it was 1969 in the riots. But the Stonewall in the UK fought for equal marriage. So, you know.
Yeah, I know. I know I know where you're coming from. Given the pandemic, what events are you organising this year?
Oh, we've got so many exciting things happening. We have got Pride Inside currently. This has started and will end on the 5th of July for UK Black Pride, who are working with Amnesty International, Para Pride, where Para Pride is the pride for differently abled, disabled, LGBT plus people. We're working with Gender Intelligence. Gender Intelligence is an amazing group that supports trans people and talks to the trans experience. You would have seen some of their work that they've put out most recently around all the vitriol that's gone out about trans people. And we're also working alongside Stonewall as well to really amplify this Pride season, but also what we do going forward. Some of those events are about well-being, mental health, and supporting each other in a time of loneliness and isolation, and how COVID has stopped prides in its track. And then we will be celebrating our 15th birthday, because we're 15 years old this year. And it's a shame we can't be there in the physical sense, but in August we'll be holding a big event with a wonderful headliner, lots of different activities for the young, the mature, you know, looking at the intersection and the whole spectrum of what our communities need.
When you started off in 2005, did you ever think it would get this big?
I think I always knew that UK Black Pride would be big. I just didn't think last year when I saw 10,000 people in Haggerston Park that we would be at this stage where people are calling UK Black Pride their home, whether they're black, they're brown, they're white, whoever they may be. It just feels like we have reached a place that UK Black Pride is on their tongues and we're speaking about it positively. So no, I didn't think it'd be this big, but I knew it'd be something.
Good for you. Now, you very famously publicly refused an invitation to apply for an MBE back in 2016. Can you talk us through what happened with that and why you made that decision, why you felt it wasn't right for you, Phyll?
Yes, and I say this with this being an internal audience, because I received probably the most hate mail and death threats to my life for rejecting the nomination to the MBE. Now, I don't really want to associate with anything that has the word empire attached to it. Empire has a very toxic legacy, and the work that I do in removing colonial era laws with amazing human rights activists is because of the empire. And I think whilst I set out to serve and support LGBT people here and abroad, until we have real equality, until we have a transparent way of looking at things, I couldn't really accept any sort of accolade that amplifies itself over the people, the very people that I'm trying to work with to remove laws. And I think it's the toxic nature of empire, colonization, and everything that happened. But I take nothing away from those who have accepted their MBE, OB, CBE, because it's wonderful to be acknowledged by the Queen for the work that you do. I just don't think that that's the right accolade for me, especially being a socialist, although some may say I'm a bit of a bougie socialist, but yeah.
And given with the word empire in mind, how do you feel about people taking down statues of historic figures who are involved with the oppression of other people? What are your thoughts on, like, those kind of symbols like statues and monuments being taken down?
So I knew you would ask me this question, and it's it's a really difficult to answer in the way I would want it to come across, because we have to understand that these statues that are seen every day by everyday people, it's not about the history, and no one's taking that away from, whether it's Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes, whether it's the last one that came down in Bristol, whether it's Winston Churchill. It is about the history itself and the history that has impacted on so many different communities. When you look at from colonization to enslavement to slavery, some of those statues are instrumental in the rise of slavery and have benefited greatly from that, whether it's through land, whether it's through housing, whether it's through privilege and access. So when society feels like the contract between them and society has been broken, the frustration of not being seen, not being heard, means that people react in different ways. Now, I am not about pulling down statues, and I am not about getting angry in that way. I think that there are different ways in how you can display the mood and the temperature, but I'm not going to also say to a young person who is doing their research and starting to feel so many different ways around Black Lives Matter, or feel so many different ways around how society treats them to do with education, housing, health, and so forth, and they make this link back to they don't have that privilege. It's hard to tell them stop, because hurt people feel hurt, right? And they may hurt other people, so they're frustrated and they're venting and they're trying to make a stance and protest in the way they see fit. But I do think that maybe the UK, the US, and maybe other European countries have to think about how it presents history. And, you know, a statue of Nelson Mandela is not going to just help us where history is concerned. What about all of those lives that had to be lost in order for people like Cecil Rhodes to have a statue there? So it's acknowledgement.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, in recent interviews that I've seen with you, specifically on the topic of kind of like, you know, Black Pride, etc., and the other work that you've done, security's kind of come up as being an issue for you kind of several times. As being such a figurehead across a number of different organizations, you know, what challenges do you face?
You know, we're in a time of COVID and lockdown, and it's been nice to be at home to press that reset button. But often when out and about, I may be recognized. I have been spat at, I have been sworn at, I have been called the N word on many different occasions, and of course the B word as well. I have received letters years ago when I lived in a particular area. Again, I don't always talk about where I live or what I, you know, where I am at because of safety, because there are people that don't like what I stand for, don't like what I'm aiming for, or the laws or the legislation that needs to be changed, whether it's religious groups, and I'm not blaming religion for or religious leaders for any sort of hate. I'm saying
No.
that in any group there are different people that will not like your being. When I lived in a particular place, I had somebody who threw a letter bomb, a firebomb through my door, and it was, you know, I have, although my daughter's 25 now, she was much younger, and that's the sort of thing that scares you about putting your head above the parapet and speaking up, whether it's on the news or whether it's any number of interviews, because you then are seen as a target. So yeah, I'm cautious about where I go to events that I'm seen at, and taking taxis or driving myself so that I'm in control and can leave. When it comes to UK Black Pride, the day itself, there are actually 2 security members that are with me if I do the walk round to say thank you and hello to those that are at the stalls, because I was once, you know, sprung on by, you know, a group of people, and it was quite frightening and daunting that, oh my gosh, but people just wanted to talk. But I saw it as, if that could happen, and I was so exposed like that, because UK Black Pride is a free event, what would happen if somebody actually entered and I was their target because they didn't like the whole idea of a UK Black Pride being in this country? So yeah, safety is, and I'm downplaying this because safety has been probably one of the biggest issues that I've had to deal with, and also having to be mindful for my daughter as well, because some of those death threats back in the day were not pleasant about, you know, my child.
That's horrible, absolutely horrible, Phyll. Well, I'm very glad that you continue to do the work that you do.
Yes, conscience doesn't allow me not to. I told you I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams, so of course I must continue.
Yeah, I get that completely.
Yeah.
Wow. You told me to come up with a little bit about why I wanted to get involved with you guys as well on that kind of side of things, which I thought was kind of an important thing to come up with. And for me, growing up as kind of like a kid in the 1980s and 1990s in Scotland, I mean, it was a mixed race gay kid who was brought up in a Catholic kind of like, you know, church and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember being chased, my mum being called names on the street, and like, I'm not even going to go into school. There was one specific situation that happened with me when I was 16, and I was working as a kitchen porter, kind of like, you know, in the next village or next town along. And it was the weekend of something in Scotland, which is called the Glasgow Fair, which is basically when everybody from Glasgow decamps outside of Glasgow and goes to the beach, or goes kind of like, you know, hill walking, or goes wherever they kind of want to go. And I remember getting on the train and going to work, and everything was rammed, like everybody was kind of wall to wall. And I was wearing really scraggy kind of like clothes because I was on my way to work and I was working in a kitchen and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember that as the train pulled into the station, an Ayr station, it was kind of like, you know, there was a whole crowd of people standing on the other side. And as the door stopped, I remember looking up and seeing this guy. I actually remember him being reasonably attractive as well. But I remember looking up and seeing this guy, and the guy's eyes kind of locked on me. And he started shouting monkey, packy, other kind of racial obscenities, making monkey noises and all of that kind of stuff at me. And there was this whole packed train and this whole packed platform. And this was 20 years ago now. So, you know, I remember in my head being hundreds of people, but it might as well have been Wembley Stadium, with all of these eyes just absolutely staring at you. And this guy was like shouting and shouting. And then the train doors opened and he was right up in my face. And I can remember feeling his spit on his face as he was like shouting and shouting and shouting and shouting. And it felt like there was 1,000 eyes on me. And I just remember the silence of everything around me, kind of like, you know, everybody was quiet and everybody was just staring. And I think as a kid at that time, you then think that everybody around agrees with him, whereas actually everybody around is actually probably just in shock, but you don't think that at the time. And I remember that I got to work and I got through the whole day with my head down, kind of scrubbing pots and pans and doing everything that I needed to do to make my pocket money. And I couldn't face getting on the train to go home. So it was about 7 miles for me to walk home, and I started walking home. And on the way, there's kind of an estate, there's numerous kind of estates and things. And I was walking past an estate and it was getting to be nighttime and all of that kind of stuff. And you've got to appreciate that in these small towns, and when you grow up in the west of Scotland, it's kind of one day somebody's like calling you a packy and chasing you down the street with a stick, or beating you up for this, or beating you up for being the gay guy. I mean, I'd like, you know, I practically had to ask them what they were, you know, discriminating against me for sometimes. And you know, can you just stop for a second and let me know why you're beating me up? You know what I mean? But some days you'd be playing football with these guys, and the next day they'd literally be wanting to kill you, and it was just kind of a very odd thing. And I was walking past this estate, and this guy started, like, who I kind of knew, started chasing, and they were shouting names and all of that kind of stuff. And then he actually made like an effort to run up to me, and he put his hand on my back and he said, "Sorry, mate." And we were just messing. And it's one of those things that I hadn't realized it, but I was actually crying. I was in floods of tears and I hadn't noticed it because I was under some sort of stress or some sort of, like, you know, it was kind of going on. But he put his hand on my shoulder and he just said, "I'm so sorry." And he didn't know what happened to me that day. He thought I was obviously upset because of him. But it was one of those things that, you know, now as being kind of like, you know, a gay dad, I've been with my partner 17 years. We've got 2 beautiful brown kids. And for them to go through something like that, it would absolutely destroy me if I thought that they ever had to go through that type of thing. And I think that that's why, from my perspective, it's kind of really important that we are vocal, that we get stuff out there, that we get stuff off our chest, and that we actually try to acknowledge people, because it's not that one uneducated guy who's standing on a train platform. It's the responsibility of the hundreds of people that are standing around to actually stand up and say something. And I think now, 20 years on, we're probably in a better place, but I know that there's still pockets of that and people that still feel that as well. And also, you know, and this is probably going to be, I work in recruitment, I go to lots of networking events and all of that kind of stuff. And for me, as, you know, a mixed race person, when I walk into a networking event, for a long time, even after that, I would look for another ethnic minority. And if I could see one, then it would reassure me, especially in Scotland. I mean, in London, I mean, you get, like, you know, there's lots of diversity, but not so much kind of like outside of London. And I think it's one of those things that you have to kind of, you have to put yourself out there and put yourself forward. So I think if you are watching this and you're thinking about, I want to get involved, then definitely contact me, definitely contact Phyll, and kind of like ask about how you can do that as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, thank you so much for sharing that. I think often we don't speak about that human element and that side of our lives that actually have informed what we do as adults. You know, the journey of the racism, the bullying that you felt could have turned you and pulled you in a very different direction. But you have I wouldn't say overcome it, but you have found ways to deal with it so that it's not in your kid's life, so that actually speaking that out into existence will make other people realize that maybe the journey that they had growing up was not too dissimilar, and look where you've arrived and how you've reached this particular point in your life. And to usualize that conversation, because even though we're saying 20 years on, things have changed. I'm also a patron of the Albert Kennedy Trust, and the Albert Kennedy Trust do some amazing work to help marginalized, vulnerable young people who have been, ousted from their homes because of being LGBTQ+, and finding them good housing. And what I've seen, I think in their latest research, it says 77% of their service users are young people of colour.
Wow.
77%. That is huge. So that tells you, and this is like quite broadly, this is not just London, it's quite broadly, that there may be a young you who is dealing with, the bullying, the isolation, or even families who don't accept them being LGBT plus. So we've got an amount of work to do. And in this day and age, whilst we're thinking 2020, things have got better, there are a lot of things which have regressed. I think laws and protections over young trans people, which we're seeing with where an MP had recently just said something quite negative about not opening up supports for young trans people. We've got to question that, because that sets people back. What's happening with Black Lives Matter movement, when people do not feel respected, valued, or see themselves in society, that pushes laws and legislation back, and you can roll back the hands of time on equality, and we could quite easily go back to a young you on that train. And I hope that we get to speak about allies, because allyship is something so important when a young person or any person from a marginalized group is facing something on a tube, a train, a bus, or just walking down the street. What does allyship really, really mean in terms of standing up, showing up, and speaking out against inequalities that maybe they may not experience, but they're seeing others experience it?
100%. I mean, coming on to the stuff that, especially, I know that Kaleidoscope, which is an organisation you're involved with, it'd be great for you to tell us a little bit about them. And also, I know that you guys did a global survey recently as well. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So Kaleidoscope Trust is the secretariat to what's called TSEN, which is the Commonwealth Equality Network, and it was accredited by the Commonwealth in 2017, and it is the only LGBT organisation in the Commonwealth, which is really, really huge for us, and we're the secretariat, as I mentioned. So we produced this report, and last month, 2 months ago, we gathered what was a testimony of about 40 plus LGBT individuals, 34 network members, which was also covering 37 Commonwealth countries in the Commonwealth region, which is like 70% of our Commonwealth countries. And, it was to look at the acute challenges of COVID-19 and how it's impacting LGBT persons in the Commonwealth space, mainly the global south. So we're talking Asia, Pacific, Caribbean, and Africa, and we have so many members in that network there. And what this survey and the research that we produced found is some really uncertain, precarious, like very, very deteriorating conditions for these communities and organizations, which we call civil society. And if you can, I just want to be able to read through, I think we've got about 7 key findings that came out of this. It was about 1, continued discrimination and stigmatization at the hands of state agents. 2, COVID-19 and the state's responses, which are putting LGBTI plus people and their physical and mental health and well-being at risk. Then there was 3, the possibility of impoverishment for LGBTI people has been heightened with the already precarious employment and housing situations, which are seriously under threat. Then there's 4, there was the barriers to accessing critical emergency goods and services such as food, medication, temporary shelter. It had really intensified over that period. It was already bad because of the laws that were in place. 5 clearly is about access to justice and the fact that, you know, it's become more and more difficult to go through judicial proceedings because the delay and the disruption that COVID-19 has presented. Then 6, we had barriers to carrying out essential work, providing services to LGBT people, which are already in challenging context. They are just emerging and also intensifying. And 7, the main one around the survival of LGBTI plus civil society organisations, their well-being, their livelihoods. It really highlighted such a dark and kind of grim picture, and hence why you're seeing a lot of humanitarian sort of crowdfunding. So for us with Kaleidoscope, we set up a campaign fundraising, not just to deal with the humanitarian side of things, but to really look at, yes, upholding rights for LGBT people and also removing colonial era laws, but the work that goes beyond that in ensuring that, you know, come December, those civil society LGBT organisations, that they're able to survive, because many of them don't even have reserves. So, you know, if you look at how their communities are going to be decimated through, you know, a lack of tourism, where many people rely on that sort of work, you can only think that if we don't raise the funds that we need to, we're going to see such a decline in the rights of LGBT people in places in the Caribbean. You know, you know, Uganda is something which is near and dear to not just my heart, but Kaleidoscope Trust, where we saw 23 people arrested just before the lockdown, and there was no access to legal aid. You know, some of them, when they were released, and that was like 49 days later when they were released, some of them were showing signs of malaria, of COVID. Some of them didn't have access to their HIV treatment, and obviously mental health and well-being was at the forefront of how they had been treated as LGBT people in Uganda, which does criminalize LGBT people. So there are so many things that we're trying to look at, that we're trying to do, and that we're trying to work with ministers, parliamentarians, high commissioners, diplomats, to really home into, this is the plight of LGBTI people in the global south. And of course, we can't discount what's happening in parts of Europe around Hungary, Poland, and, you know, the no gay zones, and, you know, the conversion therapy. All of this work is so fundamentally important. And whilst we're dealing with things here in a UK context, we've got to understand that we do still have some privileges that those abroad don't even get to see. It's legal for us to get married, to live with our partners, to walk hand in hand down the street, even though there are still some challenges. So can you imagine what it's like not having access to health, water, to equipment like masks, and just thinking about how you mobilize and organize as an LGBT person, where you know that your whole being could be arrested and locked up because of who you choose, not even choose, because of who you love, not choose. Let me correct myself there.
No, absolutely. It's horrible. On your website, there's obviously kind of like, we can't get through kind of like a webinar without talking about COVID-19 in the UK, unfortunately. But on your website, there's a lot about how to combat loneliness, isolation, mental health, and you've been encouraging people to provide opportunities for connection, joy, laughter, which, all very important. Like, for people watching this, what can they do at this time to support others?
I think it's really important right now, more than ever, for us to check in with each other. Um, you know, there are people who have had to go back to homes which may not feel as safe or comfortable for them to be in. So reach out, connect with people, send them a message and just say, how are you doing? There's this talk that's happening. Can you join? Signpost them to events that are happening that will sort of lift up spirits. But quite shamelessly plug in, UK Black Pride will have, as I mentioned, a number of events that really speak to the theme of home, but also loneliness and isolation, and how we combat that in a way that is meaningful and not just for this Pride season, but for all year round. I think what COVID-19 has shown different communities is that it is disproportionately impacting LGBT plus people, but it is also seeing such a rise in deaths of how it's disproportionately impacted Black and brown people. And coupled that together, all of that compounded, being Black Pride, we can't help but to speak about these issues and think about how we elevate and amplify our communities at this particular period when there is such a low and a place where people might fall into that sad and lonely and soul destroying dark place. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, I mean, I think the world's all been shocked by the recent events in America, specifically around George Floyd and others since then who have also lost their lives. Given the kind of accountable and sometimes kind of vitrionic kind of nature of social media, I think there's a lot of people, myself one of them, who are concerned about kind of communicating the wrong message, saying the wrong thing. I mean, what advice would you give to people who from any background, who want to show their support but are worried about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing?
So I think just to put this into context, what happened to George Floyd was horrendous, but this is not a new thing in the Black community. It's been happening. It just so happens that we're in this new age of technology where things are seen a lot more. And there is a parallel between Pride and the Pride movement that's being celebrated now, and the protests that we're seeing, and also Black Lives Matter, because our very liberation that we've been fighting for as LGBT people from 1969 Stonewall riots, 1972, the first Pride in London, to what we see today. I think what people should understand and should look at is, if you are not a person of color or Black, you don't center yourself in this discourse, but you find ways to be a true ally in a way that's not performative and not tokenistic. I think that there's an amount of reading, research, looking on the UK Black Pride website or other websites that are doing this groundwork around all Black lives mattering. And I say all Black lives because within that intersection of Black lives, you have got trans Black lives, you've got disabled or differently abled Black lives, you've got women's Black lives who are all impacted around structure and systemic racism and in different ways. But, I think that people can do a lot by highlighting different organizations, following different organizations to see what's being said, you know, I always say Google is your friend, unless it's telling you a story about yourself that's untrue. But, you know, there's a lot of information. There are books from Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, James Baldwin that talk about, you know, racism back then and what it would look like in the future, the rights that we wish to acquire. You know, I mentioned a number of organizations at the beginning: Para Pride, Gender Intelligence, you've got Rainbow Noir in Manchester, you've got Stonewall, which I believe have like a very small almanac of resources that can be used. So it's not hard for us to find resources and information that we can use to be better allies. But importantly, it's we can support these organizations by donating to their funds, so that their very survival of their organizations mean that they can continue to do the groundwork.
Absolutely. Now, this recording will obviously be circulated to kind of like, you know, lots of our clients in our database and all that kind of side of things. And these are organizations within hospitality, leisure, retail, property, etc. What advice would you give to business leaders who want to make changes, who want to do something for their employees?
So I think, you know, most businesses have like staff networks. They may have an LGBT network, a BAME network, a women's network, a young people's network. Find where the synergies are and look at how you work together all year round. And I think that way, when it comes to Pride Month or LGBT History Month, Black History Month, you have got all the different networks supporting each other, so that it creates a culture and an environment that feels inclusive, that feels that people's differences are valued. I think organizations should look at their policies as well. I think businesses really need to look at how they recruit and where they're recruiting. You know, I mentioned my daughter, 25, out of university, and where she would look for jobs is not the same place that maybe a business will put it in the Telegraph or the Guardian, or maybe just on a specific website. It has to be much broader than that. I would say, you know, showcase that advertisement to UK Black Pride. And we have the largest database of people of colour, and I don't just say black, but people of colour who also happen to be queer, that might wish to be in hospitality, recruitment, and so forth. That way, you're broadening out your reach of who is and going to apply for these jobs. I think what else businesses can do is really check in with their staff, really make sure that, again, it's meaningful engagement and not have equality on the bottom of the agenda when talking about, you know, proposals or changes to the industry or the business. Equality and diversity and inclusion has to be woven into absolutely every facet of the organization. Otherwise, in 5 years' time, you'll still be talking about, you know, the kind of Guinness effect. And I talk about the Guinness effect in a way that we have senior leaders that may be whites who are at the top and black and brown workers at the bottom. And until that Guinness has been stirred up, it means that your organization will speak to a few and not the many. And that's not me trying to bring any political acronym or insight into this, but it really needs to be, think of different mentoring programs, internships. How do you bring diversity into the organization that allows you to amplify different voices? And if the table, that boardroom table, is not reflective of the work and the services you provide out to clients, then it needs to be rearranged. And I don't mean in a tokenistic way, but you need to then find different ways to bring women's voices into this, black people's voices into there, young and disabled people's voice, and people from different faiths and backgrounds, and even thinking about class and different socioeconomic statuses that people have. You know, some of us didn't arrive from coming out of university and having a silver spoon in our mouth, but we've worked really hard to reach to a particular place. So all of that has to be broadened out. And I'm sure many of the organizations in which you work with are trying to do that, but let's make it meaningful. Let's not make it during particular history months, which can become decorative. Let's do it all year round and ensure that your strategy has a really good theory of change to support it.
Absolutely. I'm never going to look at a pint of Guinness in the same way. Thank you for that, Lady Phyll. Now, I mean, you've inspired so many people. Your story is completely inspirational by itself. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the people who have inspired you and why?
Yeah, oh my gosh, there's so many people. So somebody like Femi Otoju, who was the first Black woman to be on the London Lesbian gay switchboard, and really spoke to how we speak to different communities. She is an amazing woman who's now a consultant that talks about D&I and delivers training. You have got Audre Lorde, who I read her books. She was a famous activist, author, poet, and really talked of the intersections of different communities. You've got Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the woman who coined the word intersectionality and framed it in a way that when we look at ourselves in this intersection and the things that are about our lives, i.e. race, gender, class, sexuality, they're all things that come head on to you. So if you take out one aspect of that, there feels quite almost like a erasure of that part of you, or it feels like a dismissal of that aspect of your life. And it's really to look at the oppressions that exist and how you remove those barriers of oppression within a workplace setting. And I think people use intersectionality in different ways now, but it's not a buzzword. It's a word that has a genesis and an origin and a meaning to it because of workplace stigma and oppression and discrimination. Then you have, oh, so many people.
If I could just ask a quick question, there was a podcast interview that I saw with you, like obviously in researching for today, and you'd mentioned that sometimes you're on panels, and it might be like 4 white middle-aged men and then yourself, and they don't recognize their privilege because they speak over you and all of that kind of stuff, and you know that side of things. What do you do in that situation? Do you hold your hand up and kind of say, guys, come on? Like, how do you handle that practically in kind of everyday situations?
So now I'm very unapologetic about having my voice heard, because there are a lot of young people, and especially young women, who are looking for hope and inspiration and to also find their voice. If I know I'm going to be on a panel with 4 white men who are middle-aged, I will tell the person I'm not going to be on that panel anymore. If it so happens that, you know, it changes because somebody drops out and I'm spoken over, I am going to put a stop to it. And I'm going to say, look, I think we have to understand whose voices are often heard. And if I'm speaking and you continue to speak over me, that does actually play into the patriarchy, the misogyny of how men have their voices heard. And I get everyone has a point to make, but if you want to really know about inclusion, if you want to know about different lived experiences which can help better your organization or the conference or whatever it may be that you're in, then sometimes it's better for you to stop and listen, because you're not going to be able to be an ally if you're not listening and just talking.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just good to get some practical advice, because I'm sure that there will be a lot of young people, and specifically, hopefully, a lot of young female people of colour. And you know, you specifically think about your daughter going into a meeting and the kind of thinking, well, you know, how do you play that forward in a nice way without coming across as being like an angry person?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And I'm not combative. I'm not. Of course, there's some anger that fuels passion, but I will stop for a while and then I will find myself and articulate it in a way that, this is not the panel that I would want to be on if people continue or continually speak over me or don't allow for the difference and the beauty of other voices to be heard. I think it's important in recognizing privilege and where it's come from that, the way in how it has to be used is if you have access to particular things that this group of people do not, how do you find that way of using some of your privilege to help amplify those group of people so that you can try and look at a society and a world that puts everyone on an equal footing? Of course, we're not going to get that tomorrow or the next day, but we can work towards that. As a Black woman who is an open lesbian, I understand that even though I have challenges in dealing with racism and the things that I endure, I still have a certain amount of privilege over the human rights defenders and the work I do with activists in the global south. I have a passport that takes me to over 100 countries without a visa. Some of our activists cannot even come out of their own regional parish because they don't have the funds and the means to do it. So I channel my work through working with government and saying, this is where money needs to be placed to support people that do not have, that are less fortunate than us, not in a, again, tokenistic sort of patronizing, condescending way, but in a real meaningful way that we are trying to ensure there is equality for all. And, if there's any legacy that I leave behind, it's really about understanding that, I'm here on this earth for a period of time, and I want others to receive the same benefits that I receive. And I want to receive the same benefits that others who hold positions of power and influence, that I can receive that too. Shouldn't be one, what's good for one shouldn't be for another. It should be for all of us.
Absolutely. And final question, and I guess this is aimed at like anybody who wants to know more about this, who wants to educate themselves for allies. Are there any authors, any artists, anyone that you follow yourself who kind of inspires you? What reading can people kind of do about this?
So I'll probably even send you a list because there's so many and I may forget. But, if you're talking about, say, trans people of colour, there's an amazing woman called Monroe Bergdorf who has such a story to tell, but has made it in the modelling industry, but also talks about Blackness, queerness, and, also what businesses can do. I would even recommend her to be somebody you have a conversation with for your employees and for others around. She is absolutely amazing. And the trials and tribulations of what she's gone through, you just couldn't make that up. You have Rainbow Noir, as I mentioned. They are a young POC queer group in Manchester. There's Colours Festival, which is, again, a young POC group, which is based in Birmingham, which looks at the intersections of being young, but where do they get their funding from? I think that there's mainstream media outlets, of course, like Give Out, Gay Times, who are working with organisations like Give Out, which is a philanthropy-based grant maker, and they give funds to people like Kaleidoscope, organisations like Kaleidoscope Trust, for us to continue doing the work. And there's so many people, but I think I should create a bit of a list for you to share with others. And of course, Kaleidoscope Trust and UK Black Pride,
Yeah.
get involved. You've done your homework, you've looked on the website, and you know what we do. I think that for others that don't have an idea, do some reading. It's You know, it's really, really important that at this precise moment in time that we educate ourselves on the plight of others, but what we can do better to fight for equality, justice and freedoms for those abroad, and also ourselves here with what's happening about how COVID-19 is impacting different communities, and also supporting Black Lives Matter movement, which is not a moment, it is a movement which started off by 3 queer women of colour in America. People don't often know this. They just think Black Lives That Matter. So it does look at the intersections again of why Black Lives Matter movement was created.
Wow, that's incredible. Lady Phyll, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And I think that there's lots of really good nuggets in there that people can kind of like take away and use. And like, you're absolutely right, it's all about storytelling, and it's all about kind of like, you know, having that when you're in your day-to-day life. And I think you've given people lots of hope and lots of inspiration. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining. Well, I was going to say for joining me, probably because I'm at home. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to join you. And, you know, good luck with everything you do. And if there's any way that I can support your organisation or keep on giving information of what's out there, I'm more than happy to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't worry, we'll definitely be getting involved in some Black Pride events later on this year as well. They sound like a good time, as well as being very educational as well. So that's great.
Yeah. So you take care and stay safe and stay well. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Lady Phyll.